What about the Supreme Court? I got a call from a reporter when the Hamdi case came out in 2004. We've had 3 series of decisions, 2004, 2006, 2008. And the Chicago reporter was all excited. He said, oh, this is a great defeat for the Bush administration. I said, no, it's not. Did you read it? It's a great victory. The question before the Supreme Court was, does the president have the authority as the commander-in-chief to designate a U.S. citizen as an enemy combatant and hold him indefinitely until the war's over? The plurality opinion by Justice O'Connor, she said, the fact that we're at war, comma, I said, read the first part of that sentence. The Supreme Court has never said that we're not at war. In fact, they recognize that we're in a state of war. But what they've done is they've said that, look, this is unlike wars we've had in the past. We're fighting an individual who doesn't wear a uniform. They belong to dozens of different nation states. Therefore, we want added protections. We want somebody to look over the president's shoulder when he says that you're an enemy combatant to make sure he got it right. I mean, that's basically what they're saying. And that's what they said in Hamdi. We want an independent tribunal of some sort to look over his shoulder. The president set up the Combatant Status Review Tribunal. That was struck down in 2008 because the court said, that's not good enough. We want a federal judge to check the math. And the federal judges that have checked the math are the folks at Gitmo. Some of them, they've said there's not enough evidence to label this person as an enemy combatant. You must release them. But the majority of them, they've said, yeah, there's enough evidence to label these guys as an enemy combatant, and the president can hold them indefinitely until the war's over. And in 2006, of course, that decision, Hamdan decision, the Supreme Court said that we don't want the president to create military commissions. We want Congress to do it. So that's why Congress passed the 2006 Military Commissions Act. But the Supreme Court has clearly said that this is war. But they've added extra protections because of the phenomenon of this new type of enemy combatant that we're facing. So that's the premise. We are at war. All 3 branches of the government tell us that we're at war. Therefore, in a large picture sense, and you can nitpick here and there about things, and I can do that as well as anybody else can, but basically what we're doing is perfectly lawful. We have the right to detain people at Guantanamo Bay indefinitely until the war's over. And I would ask the president, why are we closing Guantanamo again? What are we apologizing for? If we're at war, we don't need to apologize. They incinerated 3,000 people. We have the right to detain them indefinitely until the war's over. So you may not like it. A lot of people that I talk to across the country, oh, I don't like it. That's fine. You can not like it, but it's not illegal.
Thank you, Professor Adicott. Professor Herman?
Thank you. Again, let me thank the jurist for inviting us here today. It's a great pleasure to be here. Professor Adicott was saying that we should discuss as well as debate, which I think is right, but I think we do have some points of debate as well as discussion. Are we a country at war? In part. We are at war in Afghanistan. We are at war in Iraq. And what the Supreme Court said in the Hamdi opinion, what Justice O'Connor said later in the sentence is, we are at war in Afghanistan. She said the president has permission under the authorization for the use of military force, which Congress passed in September, September 16th or whatever, it's like about a week, September 18th of 2001. The president, under that authorization for use of military force, is permitted to detain people captured on the battlefield in Afghanistan. What she did not say was that we are at war with terrorism. Now, Hamdi, as I teach my students, you have to be very careful with the Hamdi case because it does not say that the United States government can pick up Jose Padilla at O'Hare Airport in Chicago or Mr. Abdul Muttalib at the airport in Detroit and just lock him up as an enemy combatant and say, well, he's an enemy, he doesn't have rights. It's not true. We are at war in Afghanistan, and that does have consequences. Under the Geneva Conventions, we are permitted to detain as prisoners of war people who are combatants, people like the Taliban who are fighting against us in Afghanistan, until the duration of hostilities has ended. Justice O'Connor in Hamdi is very careful to talk about the war in Afghanistan as giving us the temporal duration for the hostilities that she's talking about. And in Hamdi, she was extremely concerned about the Bush administration's allegation that we could detain people indefinitely just because we declare them to be terrorists. So Hamdi is quite limited to Afghanistan. Now, what does that mean in terms of people who are caught in Afghanistan? Professor Adicott is saying if we are at war, that means that we can detain people who are members of al-Qaeda. Well, the most important thing that I would like to tell you today is that even though some people, not Professor Adicott, but some people put this debate in terms of why should terrorists have rights? And you actually mentioned something about members of al-Qaeda don't have rights. Well, that's a very nice statement to make, but how do you know who's an enemy combatant and who's a member of al-Qaeda unless you have some sort of fair proceeding to figure out who our enemies are and who they are not? Now, from the beginning, we've had, at the high point, there were 770-some people detained in Guantanamo. Most of them, in fact, had been brought to Guantanamo from Afghanistan, but not all of them. And about 85% of the people who ended up in Guantanamo had been referred to United States troops, either by Pakistan or by the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance are not particularly reliable bounty hunters. There are a number of stories of the Northern Alliance turning over individuals to the United States troops and saying, here's one, this is a member of Al-Qaeda, this is somebody who threw a hand grenade at American troops, and they were getting money for that. And they could engage in grudges or whoever they didn't like. So from the very beginning, the Bush administration always acknowledged that there had to be people in Guantanamo by mistake, because they're people who were not, in fact, terrorists and not our enemies who had been picked up. So at the beginning, what President Bush told us was that we should have Guantanamo as a land that was free of law. It should be free of any kind of law, that people in Guantanamo shouldn't have rights because enemy combatants don't have rights, we're at war, and therefore they don't get criminal trials. But also, he said, they also don't get the rights of prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention because they're not playing fair. They're having a war without uniforms, and they're doing it not in the way that nation states have wars, and therefore they don't get any rights at all. The Geneva Conventions say people should have had the right to some sort of hearing to determine whether they not they really were enemy combatants, if there was any doubt about that. That did not happen. It wasn't until after 2004 when the Supreme Court in the Hamdi case, and also in another case called Rasool versus Bush, held that the Guantanamo detainees had to have some sort of due process right, that there had to be some sort of hearing to figure out who was an enemy combatant and who was not. Okay, so how did the Bush administration do in terms of the numbers? Let me tell you first a little bit about some of the numbers, and then I want to tell you one particular story. So from a height of 770-some people at Guantanamo, over the years, hundreds of people were removed from Guantanamo and sent back to their own countries or to other countries as the Bush administration winnowed through. Most of these stories we don't know. We don't really know who was selected, who was sent back and how. This is all diplomatic negotiations happening behind a curtain, and we'll just never know the stories of somebody got released because we were friendly with their home country and somebody else didn't because we were not friendly with their home country. But there were a lot of people being removed from Guantanamo. Now, what we would like to think, I think it's reasonable to assume, that the Bush administration was removing from Guantanamo the people as to whom they had some doubt. They weren't really sure that the Northern Alliance had given them good information. They weren't really sure that these people were dangerous. So a lot of these people ended up back wherever. You can see there's a film called Road to Guantanamo, which is the story of people called the Tipton Three. They were British citizens who were at Guantanamo, and pretty early on were released from Guantanamo and sent back to Britain. So you get the numbers down, and we're now at a few hundreds, which the Bush administration says these are the worst of the worst. Okay, so they're the worst of the worst. They're the people who the Bush administration is most convinced are truly dangerous. At this point, there's talk of having military commissions to charge these enemy combatants, the worst of the worst, with war crimes. Why are these people being charged with war crimes instead of with regular crimes? Because of the idea that we're at war. Now, in a war, I don't know a lot about international law, but I learned enough about the Geneva Conventions to know that the Geneva Conventions draw a distinction between war and not war. And what they say is if we are at war, again, typically with another nation state, like we're at war with Nazi Germany, that means that if we catch a Nazi soldier on the battlefield, we can, number one, lock up that soldier for the duration of the hostilities, but number two, we are not allowed, under the rules of war, to charge that person with a crime. Why not? He was doing his job. He was working for his government. His job was to kill Americans. And so our agreement with Nazi Germany under the rules of war or any other nation is we won't charge your citizens with crimes for shooting at us, and you won't charge our citizens with crimes for shooting at us because those are the rules of war. That's what we do in war. Therefore, the idea of the military commission is that if somebody commits a war crime, they attack civilians, they do things that they were not permitted to do under the rules of war, then you can have a special charge, but you're not permitted to charge them in criminal court. Now, the Bush administration wanted to have this both ways. Did they charge people in criminal court like Jose Padilla when they wanted to? Yes. Did they also want to charge people in military commissions? Yes. Okay, so we end up with these 700 people at Guantanamo, and Professor Adicott was talking about the DC court, which has been reviewing the habeas corpus petitions. So 2004, the Supreme Court says there has to be some kind of due process. 2008, in the Boumediene case, they say, furthermore, there has to be habeas corpus.